Okay, we're going to pick up now where we left off with part two. Um, Tax cuts harm the poorest in society by cutting into programs used by low-income people. So the question is, are we a democracy? Is the United States a true democracy? Okay, and there are a number of ways to answer this question. Okay. Um, we want to look at the links between uh, wealth and power. In many ways, the U.S. government represents the privileged few rather than a majority. It's called, the term is oligopoly here. Democracy may be defined as a political system that is of, by, and for the people. It's a system under which the will of the majority prevails. There's equality before the law, and decisions are made in a democratic way. In other words, to maximize the common good. The principles that define a democracy are violated by the rules of Senate and special interest groups who use deals, the media, and the financial support of political candidates in an attempt to deflect the political process for their own profit. The argument supporting lobbying, and this is done through lobbying, is that on various issues there are lobbyists on both sides. However, the top 20 organizations in spending to influence legislation, there's only one group that might be called kind of liberal or progressive or left-leaning, and it's the American Association of Retired People. All of the rest, are groups that represent the interest of the top 1% of the income distribution in the United States. The existence of lobbyists does not ensure that the national interest will be served. Only the interests of the powerful typically get their way. Campaigns are becoming increasingly expensive. For example, to run for the candidacy of the Senate in Kentucky, which is a relatively inexpensive media state, it costs the political candidates about 10 million. For Senate, $10 million roughly. Okay, and so what this means is that that can't possibly be a democratic process. The cost of presidential and congressional elections in 2008, for example, was $5.3 billion. That was up from $2.2 billion in 1996. Even with controls, the most powerful candidates have found ways around the campaign contribution laws. We did see some brief reform with the McCain-Feingold law. That was a bipartisan bill. John McCain and Feingold was a Democrat. Before this act was passed, individuals, corporations, unions, and other organizations were allowed to give unlimited amounts of money. But there was a loophole, okay? And what happened was in 2010, the Citizens United decision invalidated the McCain-Feingold and other laws at the state level. And what happens is that individuals are limited to $2,500, but special interest groups, political action committees, can give an unlimited amount of undisclosed money to any election that they wish. Perhaps one of the most undemocratic features of the U.S. political system is how political campaigns are financed. The power elite is not organized and conspirational, but the interests of the wealthy are served nonetheless by the way in which society is organized. Super donors played a major role in the 2012 Republican presidential primaries, as 2/3 of the money for the candidates' super PACs came from mega donors who contributed at least $500,000. In 2008, pharma spent $200,000 on federal elections. In 2010, the Citizens United invalidated the earlier campaign reform, the McCain-Feingold reform law, by ruling a constitutional guarantee of free speech means that corporations and other organizations can spend unlimited funds. Being wealthy or having access to wealth is essential for victory because of the enormous cost of the race. A few wealthy individuals can fund their own candidacies. We're seeing the rise, for example, of Donald Trump. A serious candidate for high office must raise a considerable amount, and most of this will represent a limited constituency. Wealthy individuals and special interest groups. Affluent individuals and the largest corporations influence candidate selection by giving financial aid to those candidates sympathetic to their views and by withholding support from those whose views are different. The power elite refers to the concentration of power in the hands of a small group. Power in the U.S. is concentrated among people who control the government and the largest corporations. Power positions of high government positions are positions on boards of corporations. It would be a mistake, however, to equate personal wealth and power. Great power is manifested only through decision-making in the very large corporations or in governments. The interests of the powerful are served through the way in which society is structured in three ways. First, by the elite's influence over elected and appointed government officials at all levels. Second, by the structure of the system. And third, by ideological control of the masses. An ideology, incidentally, just as for your information, is an internally consistent set of beliefs. So systematic imperatives limit the decisions made by decision makers. So the power elite can get its way without actually being mobilized at all into any sort of a conspiracy. How does this work? A bias pressures a government to do certain things and not to do other things. Inevitably, this bias favors the status quo, allowing people with power to continue to exercise it. No change is easier than change. The current political and economic systems have worked and generally are not subject to questions, let alone change. The laws, customs, and institutions of society resist change. Thus, the property and the wealthy benefit while those without property and the poor remain disadvantaged. Power is the ability to get what one wants from someone else by force, authority, manipulation, or persuasion. So we're looking at authority. That's a legitimate, it's called legitimate, meaning it's got the imprimatur of those in power, through legal means. That's what authority is, power. U.S. schools, churches, and families possess this power. Schools, for instance, consciously teach youth that capitalism is the only correct economic system. This indoctrination of conservative values achieves a consensus among the citizenry concerning the status quo. If you have any question about this, look at the way history is taught in high schools and the material that people are required to teach. Each of us comes to accept the present arrangements in society because they seem to be the only options that make sense. There's general agreement on what is right and wrong. Consequences of concentrated power. Who benefits from how power is concentrated in U.S. society? At times, almost everyone does, but often the decisions made tend to benefit the wealthy. Whenever the interests of the wealthy class with those of other groups, or even of the public at large, the interests of the former are served. When the market crashed in 2008, who was bailed out? Not individuals. When a corporation is found guilty of major crimes, how do the punishments compare to those of street criminals? The bias today is nothing new. Since the founding of the country, the government has favored the interests of the wealthy. General principle of the relationship between the government and big business is that the government benefits the business community with hundreds of billions in subsidies annually. Corporations receive a wide range of favors, tax breaks, direct government subsidies to pay for advertising, research, and training costs, and incentives to pursue overseas production and sales. This textbook gives many examples, but here are a couple. 11 days after the terrorist attacks on September 11, Congress rushed through a $15 billion bailout of the airlines, but nothing was appropriated for the 140,000 fired airline workers or to the 2 million people employed by the hotel industry whose jobs were at risk. In 2008, the more than $700 billion in government bailouts to banks and financial firms actually rewarded them for their behaviors in the Great Recession. The government could help the disadvantaged, but trickle-down solutions fall under the idea that helping businesses helps everyone else. Trickle-down solutions actually cause harm. Tax breaks to the wealthy help the wealthy become wealthier, increasing the gap. Trickle-down solutions create greater national debt. When the debt is higher, government cuts are made to programs that help the disadvantaged. And trickle-down solutions have actually shown there's a very weak correlation between job growth and helping the wealthy. So typically, social programs for the disadvantaged were targeted, but not subsidies for businesses or tax breaks for homeowners. If we look at, for example, there's a historical component to it with the draft. A careful analysis of the draft when it existed reveals that it's really a tax on the poor. During the height of the Vietnam War, for instance, only 10% of college men were drafted, allowing 40% of draft age, although 40% of draft age men were in college. Wars are fought by those from disadvantaged backgrounds. The economic advantages are appealing. In most areas, the poor, because they have no power, bear the burden of society. The United States sometimes sells arms overseas, which benefits U.S. corporations to both sides in the conflict. Why? If we didn't sell them, someone else would, so why not make a profit? The United States has favored foreign governments to support our corporate interest, even if they're tyrannical. The United States has intervened in domestic affairs of foreign governments to protect U.S. corporate interests. How can social change occur when money interests block change in policy or deplete resources? Those in office are from a different social class and the have-nots. Without representation in the decision-making process, the voices of the have-nots will not be heard. Elected officials are looking toward the next election and spend part of the time in office raising money. How can they do their jobs if they're on the fundraising trail? Candidates from both major political parties seek funds from the same corporations and interest groups. The views of the political parties on social policy are closer than we realize to appeal to the people giving money. If people feel their vote doesn't count because they are not among the wealthy who participate, this is reflected in voter turnout numbers. If you can hire special assets as decision makers, you also get special treatment.